This video goes over Native Americans and early colonialism. In some sections, Native people are talked about in the past tense, but it's important to note that there are many Native people today. In some Indigenous communities, there were Two-Spirit people, people who didn't fit into European gender roles. Two-Spirit people combine the activities and roles of both men and women. Some married people of the opposite sex, and some married people of the same sex. Two-Spirit people were part of most tribes, but they looked different in different tribes. In Navajo culture, Two-Spirit females would take on male roles, such as hunting, fighting in battles, and being chief. In the Lakota tribe, Two-Spirit males were known as Winkate. Winkate performed female roles such as cooking and fixing moccasins, and some Winkate were partners with other men. In the Ojibwe tribe, Two-Spirit people were seen as doubly blessed, because they had the spirit of a man and the spirit of a woman. In the Crow tribe, men who dressed as women and did women's work were honored, and women who fought in battles and had many wives were respected. Some tribes had female divine figures, and many tribes were naked or wore few clothes. When Europeans encountered Native people, especially those who didn't fit into their ideas about sex and gender, they were judgmental and sometimes violent. One example of this is when Spanish conquistador Vasco Núñez de Balboa encountered a Native tribe in Panama. He saw that some of the Native men were dressed as women, and Balboa believed they had sexual relationships with other men. Balboa decided to release vicious dogs upon them. The men were forced to flee for their lives. All Native people faced violence from colonizers. In 1495, Columbus abducted 1,500 Arwen people, including children, and shipped them off to be sold into slavery. Of the 500 shipped, only 300 survived. From 1819 to 1969, Native children were taken from their homes and put in boarding schools in an effort to, quote, civilize them. They were given English names and weren't allowed to speak their native language. Abuse was common, and many children were hit, starved, or put in solitary confinement. Between 1830 and 1850, a time period often referred to as the Trail of Tears, tens of thousands of Native Americans were forcibly removed from their homes. Thousands of people died. Native Americans weren't granted citizenship on land that they had lived on for thousands of years until 1924. Native people still face violence today. More than 4 in 5 Native American adults experience violence. More than 56% of Native women experience sexual violence. Cases of murder, rape, and violent crimes against Native people are all higher than national averages. Europeans came to the Americas with strict ideas about gender and sexuality. Many Europeans, including the Italians, the Spanish, the Dutch, and the British, came to America, but the British had the most influence on American culture and thought. In 1620, over 100 Puritans, aka Pilgrims, arrived in America. 10 years later, about 1,000 Puritans had formed a self-ruling community. These Puritans came from England. English culture had diverse ideas about gender and sexuality. For the time, cross-dressing was condemned by Catholic theologians, but it was common in English theaters. In England, women weren't allowed to perform in plays, so men would cross-dress so that the stories could have female characters. Many of Shakespeare's works had gender and sexual ambiguity. The Twelfth Night had a cross-dressing main character. Same-sex relationships were illegal, but those laws were enforced haphazardly. James I, one of England's kings, had erotic relationships with other men. It was publicly acceptable to discuss same-sex attraction. Most of it probably wasn't talked about in a positive light, but the fact that it was talked about at all was a big deal for the time. Some people thought these behaviors were sinful, so other sects of Christianity formed, like the Quakers, Muggletonians, and Puritans. The Puritans wanted to turn England back into a pure state. They thought England was promoting sexual promiscuity and same-sex acts. The Puritans didn't like England, and England didn't like the Puritans either, so the Puritans fled to the New World, aka America. Once there, the Puritans set up strict laws and consequences for defying gender and sexual norms so that people wouldn't fall into temptation like they did in England. Many of these laws were based on English laws or passages from the Bible, and many of them targeted sex. Anyone who had non-reproductive sex could be punished by these laws. All of the laws included words like abomination or the unspeakable crime against nature, and all of them were capital offenses. People were punished, sometimes by death, for breaking these laws. Given how long ago this happened, it's hard to have an accurate picture of the time, but we do have court records and journals. Men were often punished more than women under these laws, and people who had same-sex sexual encounters were punished more often than people who had opposite-sex sexual encounters. Nicholas Tennyson from Windsor, Connecticut, was punished under these laws. He was whipped and publicly shamed on the gallows. Nicholas Sanderson was married with no children and was known to seek out sex with other men. He had been doing this since the 1640s and was talked to by the village elders a couple times, but wasn't charged until 1677. Why weren't charges brought before him sooner? It could be because he had a high social status and the men he pursued had a lower social standing. It could also be because his sexual activity took place in private and was less likely to disrupt the community than if he was pursuing women. If he was pursuing women, there could be a child out of wedlock. Puritan society valued community and was based on family structures. Anything that went against the idea of a heterosexual family was seen as immoral. The Puritans acknowledged pleasure and desire, but they believed that for the sake of society, it should only happen within marriage. There were laws against premarital sex, but it would often go unpunished if it led to a marriage. If it led to a successful marriage, then they would contribute to society in what the Puritans saw as a positive way, so there was no need for them to be punished. The Puritans also had strict gender norms, and the people who defied them were punished. One example of this is Anne Hutchinson. She had a Bible study group where she criticized Puritan interpretations of the Bible. Her group had both men and women. Women didn't normally preach, so this act defied gender norms and religious norms. She was labeled a sexually dangerous woman and exiled. She and her followers went to Providence plantations. Anne Hutchinson threatened gender norms, and because of that, she was forced out of Puritan society. When preaching, she had authority over men, and when she questioned Puritan interpretations of the Bible, she questioned Puritan society. In the Puritans' eyes, she had overstepped her place as a woman. Another example is Thomasine Hall. Hall was born with both male and female parts, and switched between acting like a man and acting like a woman. Hall wore men's clothes while serving in the military, but donned women's clothes while working as a servant in Virginia. Questions about Hall's gender identity spread throughout the community, and several members took it upon themselves to examine Hall's body without permission. Eventually, the issue made its way to the court, who ruled that Thomasine Hall was both a man and a woman. Hall was forced to wear both men's and women's clothes at the same time. While this ruling wasn't exile or death, it was still a punishment. The mixed clothes made it clear that Hall was different. The court ruling likely made life harder for Thomasine Hall. Hall could no longer switch between male and female roles and was singled out from the community. Puritan society was also based on religion. Although they had traveled from Great Britain for religious freedom, it was for their religious freedom, not everyone's religious freedom. They didn't like religious diversity. In 1634, when Pastor Roger Williams openly supported religious freedom and proposed that Native people be treated better, he was exiled. In exile, he founded Providence Plantations, the place where Anne Hutchinson and her followers ended up. Providence Plantations was a fairly progressive colony for the time. They didn't try people for witchcraft, they rarely killed people for their crimes, and in 1652 they were the first state to abolish slavery. To review, in many indigenous societies there were two-spirit people who held both male and female roles. When Europeans encountered Native people who didn't fit into their ideas of sex and gender, they were often violent. Many Native people faced violence from colonizers and still face violence today. The Puritans came from England, which had diverse ideas about gender and sexuality for the time. The Puritans didn't like that, and once in the New World, they set up strict rules about sex and gender, and the punishment for breaking them was harsh. The Puritan society valued community and was based on family structures and religion. I'd like to end this video by paraphrasing a passage from A Queer History of America by Michael Bronski, one of my sources for this video. Throughout history, sexual and gender deviance have been used as reasons to deny certain people full rights as citizens. It's important to remember that there is no universal baseline of acceptable sexual or gender behavior.